I'm very excited this evening to welcome Thomas Swick to discuss his book, Falling Into Place, A Story of Love, Poland, and the Making of a Travel Writer. Falling Into Place is the personal story of a young man's discovery of the world and his development as a travel writer. It is also a love story, as he and Hania overcome cultural differences, communist bureaucracy, and unhealthy separations. Intertwined with both is the story of revolution that altered history. With the world's attention once again turned to Eastern Europe, a Cold War reality, this memoir can help Americans better understand both. Thomas Swick was the travel editor of the South Florida Sun-Sentinel from 1989 to 2008, during which time the newspaper's name appeared in the first 9 editions of the Best American Travel Writing. He is author of 4 books, and his work has appeared in national newspapers and magazines, literary journals, and anthologies. He currently lives with his wife Hania in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and you can find him at thomasswick.com. Swick will be in conversation this evening with Eric Weiner. Weiner is the author of 4 books, including New York Times bestseller, The Geography of Bliss, which has been translated now into 24 languages. A former correspondent for NPR and the New York Times, Weiner has reported from more than 36 countries. His work has appeared in the New Republic, Slate, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the New York Times Magazine, there we go, and the anthology Best American Travel Writing. He divides his time between Pete's and the den downstairs, so you can read more at ericweinerbooks.com. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Thomas Swick and Eric Weiner.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yes, sir. I don't think the mic is on. Is it on?
Hello? Yeah.
Now it's on. Okay. Well, welcome, everyone. You're in for a real treat because I have read Tom's latest book, and I really love it, and I am sure you will too. It is hard to classify. Is it a travel log? Yeah. Is it a Cold War history? It's that. But it's also a love story. In fact, I think it's primarily a love story, whether it's love for the lovely Hania or love for a country or love for books, love for a way of being in the world. It's definitely all those things. So bravo, Tom. There's a lot going on in these pages. And I think the best way to convey the flavor of the book is to give people a little taste, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for that nice introduction. I'm going to read just a short section. This is from the 2nd chapter, and this is shortly after I arrived to Warsaw for the first time, and it was just after Hania's mother died. Hania was an only child, and her father had been killed in a motorcycle accident when she was a teenager. This was years after he and Helena had divorced. The marriage, never ideal, had been irreparably damaged by Helena's imprisonment. In fact, she had given birth to Hania in prison after being tried, while pregnant, for activities against the state. Her crime was providing assistance to a man sent back to Warsaw from the government in exile in London. Despite these early traumas, once on a visit to the prison, little Hania screamed at the sight of a woman she failed to recognize as her mother. She claimed to have had a happy childhood. As a teenager, she had made the decision to enroll in Szymanów, the all-girls Catholic boarding school her mother had attended, because she wanted an education free of socialist propaganda. When Hania first told me this, I thought back painfully to my teenage concerns. Helena Matrash was buried in Powązki Cemetery, which is to Warsaw what Père Lachaise is to Paris, though with more of a heroic, martial character. I was assigned to a motherly friend, and after the casket had been lowered into the ground, I saw Hania being escorted out by a band in black, including a young man who led her on his arm. I felt an immediate tinge of jealousy until I told myself he was probably a cousin. But that was a shock after the exclusive idol of Trenton, seeing Hania in her world. Adam, the ex-boyfriend, stopped by the apartment. He was a well-built, handsome man with a dark goatee. He pulled me into the bedroom and opened the Polish-English dictionary. After searching for a few seconds, he indicated the verb for love, kochać. Next, he moved to P and showed me pomagać, help. Then, looking me in the eye, he pointed in the direction of the living room where Hania sat. I had just gotten my first lesson in Polish gallantry.
All conveyed with 2 words, basically. Thank you. We're going to get back to Warsaw, but first, as we know, all roads to Poland lead through Trenton, New Jersey. Apparently, you are a native son of New Jersey.
I am.
Proudly so.
Yes.
And so I'm a bit of a student of genius. I wrote a book called The Geography of Genius,
Right.
and about these places around the world that produced an inordinate number of brilliant minds and great ideas. And in an oversight, I overlooked Trenton, New Jersey, because you were at the Trenton Times, and this newspaper and the whole milieu there has produced writers that everyone in this room probably knows: David Maraniss and Blaine Hardin. There was a Nobel laureate affiliated with the newspaper indirectly.
Yes.
So what was in the water in Trenton, New Jersey at the time?
Well, you know, the bridge over the Delaware River in Trenton says, "Trenton makes, the world takes." And it was true with the newspaper. I got the job there in 1977, and the Trenton Times was owned then by the Washington Post, something I didn't realize when I applied for the job. And most of the people came there from other smaller newspapers, but they were generally young, bright, ambitious, with really big dreams of what they were going to do in their careers.
Bigger than Trenton, New Jersey?
Bigger than Trenton,
Okay.
yeah. And, you know, it was just a great place to be. And it was shortly, I started working there in 77, so it was not that long after Watergate. And Woodward...
Journalism was sexy then.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Woodward and Bernstein made it as sexy as it was going to get, I think. And, you know, I remember we would talk writing. You know, it's not just that we wanted to be, a lot of them wanted to be investigative reporters, but we were all interested in writing. And we would read, you know, the latest New Yorker, and we'd look at, you know, Kenneth Tynan's profiles. But the real hero of everyone there was John McPhee. For his long narratives in the New Yorker, and he lived just up the road in Princeton.
Right. So there was something in the air back then.
Yeah. There was.
Now, you've always been throughout your life and career sort of journalism adjacent, I would call it. Some of your best friends are journalists. You've traveled in similar circles, but you've never considered yourself a journalist. And it took you a long time to call yourself a writer as well. Can you talk a bit about your identity?
Well, for one thing, I don't like coffee. I've never drunk coffee, and that just eliminates me from the
it is a requirement
of journalist.
Right.
I never wanted to be a reporter. I got into newspapers, as you did back then, because it was an easy way to get a byline. It was the way you would start writing. You know, you'd start at a newspaper and then maybe move on to...
Hemingway was a newspaper writer.
Yeah, many people were. So that's what I did. And luckily, the people at the Trenton Times had the good sense to hire me as a feature writer, not as a reporter. And feature writing was a perfect fit. I was going out, spending a day or two with some interesting person, and coming back and writing about it. I was not writing on daily deadlines, which I never got used to doing. And it was really great training to be a travel writer, getting out into the world, meeting some of the interesting people in it. So I was very fortunate in that regard. And then after a year and a half at the paper, I decided to leave and go to Poland, because I had met Hania.
Okay. So let's stop there for a second. So pre-Hania, if you could cast your mind back then, would you have said that I'm going to go to... Was Poland on your radar?
No, not at all.
Not at all?
Not at all.
What did you know about Poland then?
I knew very little about Poland. Okay. But I met Hania in London. And interestingly enough, I met her because I was carrying a book by V.S. Pritchett called Foreign Faces.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a book. It's a very good travel book about his travels through Eastern Europe in the 60s. And I bought it not because I was interested in Eastern Europe, but I was interested in travel writing. I already had an idea then that I wanted to write travel. And I liked V.S. Pritchett. So I bought the book and I went back to my hotel. She happened to be working in the bar that night. We started talking. She told me she was from Poland. I showed her the chapter of this book I just bought, set in Poland. And I lent her the book knowing she'd have to see me again to give it back.
Assuming she would return it.
She did.
Okay. Because apparently there's some people who borrow books but don't return them. Why travel writer? Why not food writer? Why not novelist? Why not poet? Why not historian, although you have some of that in you clearly. And we're talking now the 1970s, so let's kind of place ourselves in that time. What was going on with the genre and what about it intrigued you?
Well, in 1975, Paul Theroux, many people here know that name, Paul Theroux, published a book called The Great Railway Bazaar. And it's a book about his taking trains from London through Europe, through Asia, and back on the Trans-Siberian Express. And it was a huge critical success and popular success. And that, excuse me, that really put travel writing on the map.
Right.
And I loved the book too. I mean, what I loved is that he ignored the sights. He wasn't a typical travel writer writing about, the Eiffel Tower and the Taj Mahal. He wrote about the interesting people he met, the characters that entered the trains that he rode. And it just seemed to, he was a novelist. He'd written some novels that had not been terribly successful. That was his big hit, the travel book. But he brought a novelist sensibility, with this narrative arc, with this colorful characters, dialogue, all that made the travel book really come alive.
Right.
So that was the beginning of this really a heyday of travel writing that lasted for about 15 years.
Right. So your timing was good.
Yeah.
What can the travel writer do that the journalist can't? What freedoms do you have? What possibilities are there?
Well, the nice thing, one of the things is that a reporter has to go and interview people, right? And interviews I've always found are a bit artificial.
And kind of mercenary. You're looking for something from them.
Yeah, and the person you're interviewing is playing a game too and only giving so much.
Right.
When you're a travel writer, you don't interview people. You basically have conversations. You just sit down and talk with people, as from researching your books.
Right.
And I love that about it. You really got, I think, a sense of the person, a sense of the place, just by having a conversation.
And the conversation doesn't have to be linear. In fact, some of the best ones are circuitous.
Right.
Right.
Then the story itself, it doesn't have to be direct. It can be nuanced. It can have atmosphere. I think it's a much broader kind of writing, and that's what I wanted to do.
Right, right. No, I'm totally on board with that. So you fall in love with Hania, and she is sort of in love with you. Let's be honest, right?
Yes, she was.
It took a while for her to be fully on board, but she's here tonight, so she must be fully on board. And all of a sudden, you're going to pick up and go to Poland, and this is a different time. This is, they're not using the euro. They're not part of anything. They're part of the Eastern Bloc. They're behind the Iron Curtain. It's not an easy place to get to. It's not a land of affluence. And you arrive not speaking a word of Polish and describe yourself as a helpless foreigner who was unable to buy groceries. What were those first days in Warsaw like for you?
Well, they were difficult, obviously because of the death of Hania's mother. It was a very hard time for Hania, and I was sometimes kind of left to my own to fend for myself. And I remember I went out to buy some water one day, and I came back with a bottle of white vinegar instead. and that's why I said I was unable to even buy groceries.
If there were groceries to be had, right?
There were
shortages.
This was in 78.
Okay.
78. So
Okay.
there were supplies, there were goods in the shops. The shops were not like the shops I was used to in the United States. You know, it was kind of bare bones, and the staff of the shops were not friendly. There was no such thing as, you know, consumer.
People did not say "Have a nice day."
No,
Okay.
they did not. But you know, it was a shock seeing, you know, my first Eastern European country. At the same time, thanks to Hania, I had access to the world indoor, you know, the homes. I had access to what home life was like in Poland, and that was completely different from life on the street. And that I found was really invigorating. Poles were very free to speak with their mind indoor, you know, at home with friends and family. There were always these lively discussions. There were long, you know, meals at the dinner table. It was just a life at home was so different from life out in public.
Right.
It was
So the casual traveler, even journalist, will go to one word to describe Poland and Warsaw in particular, and that's gray. That's the go-to adjective.
It is.
And I confess, I think I've used it myself. And is it fair? In a way, yes or no?
Well, it's fair if you're describing, as I say, the physical world, just the exterior world. But what I found living there and getting to know the people, it was the opposite. It was very colorful. It was very animated. It was, as I say, invigorating. It was a great place.
You just have to get past the gray facade.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You grow fond of the Poles and of Poland, and you say at one point, Poles appeared to be in touch with the essentials, the eternals, in a way Americans were not. Now, we are and were the richest, most powerful country in the world. We've got, you know, happiness in one of our founding documents. But you say that Poland, behind the Iron Curtain, is in touch with the essentials, the eternals, in a way Americans were not. What do you mean by that?
Well, that sentence, I think, comes at the end of a description of November 1st, which is the Day of the Dead in Poland. But it has nothing to do, or very little to do, with the Mexican Day of the Dead, which many of us are familiar with. Everybody goes to the cemeteries. But it's a very somber day. People clean the family graves. And then in the main cemetery, which I mentioned in the section I read, Powązki, there's a large military section. And people end up going there. And there's sometimes lines, people lined up to pay tribute to the soldiers who died in the wars. And some of the graves are marked by simple birch crosses, and then you read the names and the ages of the dead, and they're 18, 19 years old. And what I admired was the way that Poles remembered them and kept them in their hearts and in their minds. This is a huge holiday in Poland. I mean,
well, how's that different from, say, Veterans Day or Memorial Day here?
Because we don't go en masse to cemeteries.
We go shopping.
Yeah. And there were buses. People would be bussed into the cemetery. And then November 1st in Poland is invariably a kind of a gray, misty day. And so at dusk, that cemetery takes on this really otherworldly atmosphere. There's a mist falling, and you see the smoke from the candles, and it's just a very moving experience.
You also describe them as possessing a rebellious spirit and a keen sense of the absurd. I think I get the rebellious spirit part, given their resistance in 1939 and later against communist rule.
Right.
What about the sense of the absurd? What do you mean by that?
Well, if you live in Poland, you just develop this. I think it's kind of an innate thing. They have. I found a wonderful sense of humor, a sense of irony.
Kind of dark humor.
Dark humor,
yeah.
and there were always political jokes when I was there. They would just come out. I mean, nobody knew who came up with them, but everybody was telling them, and they were hilarious. And they weren't just funny; they were illuminating about the situation. But the one thing I remember, I mean, as soon as I got there, the tallest building in Warsaw for years was a building called the Palace of Culture. And it was a gift from the Soviets. It was one of these huge, ugly concrete towers that just lorded over the city.
Was it gray? I think it was gray.
It was actually brown.
Okay. There we go.
But it took you an entire city block to walk by it. And Hania told me early on that Poles would walk by it when it was completed and look up and say, it's small, but in good taste.
That kind of humor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't laugh out loud, you smile knowingly. So in reading the book and knowing that your home is New Jersey and where you came from, and your adopted home was Poland. And I started to see similarities between the two, because you wrote a book early on in your career called New Jersey Unexpected Pleasures. And I'm suggesting you could have written Poland Unexpected Pleasures. They're both underdog places. Neither place gets a lot of respect. There are jokes made at their expense.
Right.
But they're also very cultured places that are underappreciated. Is Poland the New Jersey of Europe? Or is New Jersey the Poland of the U.S.? I don't know.
Well, in the book, I make the comment that Poland is cursed by its geographical location. Right?
Yeah.
It's for centuries it's been caught between Germany and Russia. And
the big sign that says "Invade me," I think, pretty much.
And if you think about it, New Jersey is kind of stuck between New York and Pennsylvania.
Right.
Though those two, they're large, but they've been happily non-aggressive, except for the jokes emanating from Manhattan about New Jersey. So there's that. I think they both share this kind of underdog status, and I've always been, I guess, because I grew up in New Jersey, I think I've always been attracted to the underdog, the unsung. And as a travel writer, I've often focused on writing about those places, in part because that's where you get your best stories, because they have been overlooked. So it's easy to find new material because they haven't been written to death.
Right.
And the people who live there, rather than being fed up with visitors, are really kind of happy to see you, because
so easier to write about Poland than France, for instance. Much easier, in a way.
Yeah. Easier to write about, harder to sell.
That's the thing. You have to get people interested in Poland.
Yeah.
I always thought that, a good travel writer needs one skill mainly, which is to be lucky. Like luck plays a role. But as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. So your mind was prepared, but you got lucky. This was a Eastern Bloc backwater that all of a sudden was thrust into the news with the Solidarity movement and the overthrow and the events that took place.
Yeah.
Do you feel that you got lucky?
Yes, I do. I mean, in terms of getting material to write about. I'd always kept a journal since college. In Poland, it became a diary. There was just so much happening, and everything, because of once Solidarity started in 1980, and then martial law was declared in 81. It's just, I've never lived in a place where everyday life had such meaning to it. Little acts.
Close to the bone.
Yes. And I would come home and I'd have to write down the things that happened that day. So yeah, I had a lot of material, and I was in a good place. I was in a place that the world was interested in for a while. When I was in Poland from 80 to 82, Poland was basically on the front pages of the world's newspapers a lot of the time. So when I came back in 1982, I thought, well, I have a book. I have something to write about.
Right. So it wasn't all peaches and roses, though. You're struggling. There is the small issue of the Polish language, which you describe, I'm pretty close to a quote here, a bitch of a language. Or the language is
tough.
a bitch. Yes. And you describe at one point attempting to read a Polish poet and doing okay until you ran smack into, quote, a wall of consonants, which sounds painful. Were you okay?
Yeah.
Okay, you recovered.
Polish is a difficult language.
But you studied it. What? Like I know maybe it's an obvious question, but your wife speaks beautiful, fluent English, refused to speak to you in Polish, actually. And a lot of Poles either spoke English or wanted to learn English. In fact, you were teaching English.
Right.
Why wrestle with the bitch of a language?
Well, I wanted to learn as much as I could about the country, and I couldn't learn that much without speaking the language.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when I came back in 1980, Solidarity had just started. And people were having these intense discussions, and people were reading the newspaper. I wanted to know what they were talking about, what they were reading. And that spurred me on to learn it as quickly as I could. But yeah, the pronunciation was difficult and the grammar was difficult.
And you described resisting that grammar, fighting against it until one day you decided to stop fighting it and to embrace it. Meaning, it's just the way it is, and I'm either going to learn. I'm not going to change the grammar. Right. I've got to learn it.
Just accept it.
Yeah.
And some of the words in Polish are just beautifully descriptive, and just the sound of them. Mm-hmm. You know, the word for rain is deszcz. And it kind of sounds like rain falling. And then if it's a cold rain, you get shivers, and those are dreszcz.
Oh, that's good.
And that, you're just shivering when you say that word.
Yeah, that's good. And you are teaching English. You call teaching English overseas the last refuge of the expat. And they hired you because of your educational skills. No, because you spoke English, right?
Yeah,
that was the qualification.
There weren't a lot of us there.
Yeah.
It
was not a pedagogical test first. It's just he speaks English. Okay.
Yeah, let's hire him.
And you struggled at first, but you seemed to really get into it and really enjoy getting to know your students. And you seemed like you were a good teacher.
I hope I was. My students were wonderful, and I think they spoiled me for teaching perhaps in this country. They were very... Well, you said they wanted to learn English. Right. And they came to this school. This was one of the few private schools in Warsaw. They came there in the evening we had classes from 3 to 9. So they already had a day of school. And then in the evening, they came to to study English. And they were so eager and so talented. I mean, the way they learned and studied, it was very impressive. Again, because I was struggling to learn their language at the same time they were studying my language. It was kind of a fun to see how I was making more progress, obviously, because I was in their country. And but I really did enjoy it. And there's a certain, I don't know if anybody here has ever taught your own language, but first of all, you learn a lot about your own language when you teach it, things you never even thought about, because you have to explain why do we do this.
Do you learn how insane English is too? Like,
yeah, you do.
Makes no sense.
Exactly. Right. So yeah, you learn about your own language, and then you get this wonderful satisfaction on seeing a face just light up with understanding. Mm. And that's kind of like almost instant gratification. And I got very attached to my students. I really
Have you stayed in touch with any of them?
I have. I just was back in Warsaw in September, and I met with one of my students who became a journalist.
There you go. So the worst thing that can happen, I think, for a travel writer, the absolute worst, is when everything goes perfectly and according to plan. I mean, that's death for a travel writer, right? You agree with that?
Yeah, well, the saying, the worst trips make the best stories.
Yes, I've also heard bad choices make good stories too. There's that same idea. So you meet one of these perfect travelers. He's a young American. I think you met him in Athens, actually, but he had spent time in Poland as well. He seemed, you describe him as cool and unfazed, while you, Tom, were a fearful, pathetic amateur. And at first, I think this bothers you. But then, and I'm going to read this because I think it's just lovely, you sort of embrace your kind of tortured approach to a place. By contrast, my sensitivity to my surroundings, my capacity for awe, my live wire imagination, at least in the realm of personal calamity, all caused me to experience life more as a drama, sometimes comic, than as a breeze, and qualified me to be a chronicler of my travels. The beauty of being impressionable, a word usually used pejoratively, is that it leaves you with a lot of impressions. I thought that was great.
Thank you.
Because you want bad things to happen so that you change and grow as a person. Is that more or less true?
Yeah, but I mean, I wrote that after what happened. I took trains from Warsaw to Athens when I left Poland the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really harrowing journey, at least for me. It was overnight trains from Warsaw to Budapest, and Budapest to Bucharest, Bucharest to Sofia, Sofia to Athens. And I slept sitting up. I hardly ate anything. The stations were, in Bucharest, it was a horrible station at night. I just felt not threatened, but in a way just completely out of place, and something could have happened to me. And I just felt I was kind of like a quivering traveler, and
right.
all alone, and
then you meet this cool customer.
And then I met this American in Athens who did the same trip, and he was so blasé about it. It was a breeze. And I thought, what am I doing? I can't be a travel writer because I everything is kind of more of a ordeal for me. But then I realized that fact that it is ordeal, it makes an impression, gives me something to write about.
Absolutely. So there are lots of characters, wonderful characters in this book, but one of the characters in the book is the book. Not this book per se, but all books. You read a lot in Poland, on trains. I think reading on trains is one of life's greatest pleasures, personally. And you say something very interesting. You say our reactions to books can be determined as much by where we read them as by when. How does the location of where you read a book affect what you get out of it?
Well, that I wrote after reading V.S. Naipaul, A House for Mr. Biswas, one of my favorite novels, in Warsaw. And if you've read Naipaul, or that novel in particular, it's set in Trinidad. And I was in Warsaw, gray Warsaw, right? It was cold. It was
complete opposite of Trinidad.
It was damp, and I was reading his lush descriptions of this Indian family in Trinidad, and I kind of overlooked some aspects of the book, like the fact that the main character, the kid that's based on Naipaul, is kind of a very unsympathetic character. But I discovered rereading the book many years later. But because I was so transported by his descriptions of Trinidad, that kind of got lost on me in Warsaw.
I always tell, I teach writing occasionally, some workshops, and I always tell my students, there are only two things you need to do to be a writer. You need to read and you need to write.
Yeah.
And is that how you learned travel writing? By reading?
Definitely.
Well, not just travel writing, but you read broadly.
Yeah, and I never took a travel writing course. The only writing course I took was a short story writing course that was given in college back in the 70s. So, I just learned by reading other writers. And then, like a place like the Trenton Times, where I was surrounded by people who were they were reporters and journalists at the time, but many of them were going to become writers. And we talked about articles we were reading and books we were reading. And then we got that, that community of writers together. And that was very helpful.
The epigraph for the book is from Freya Stark, and she talks about the distinction between real versus bogus travel. What is the difference? What is real travel? What is bogus travel in your mind?
I'm not quite sure exactly what she means, but I think, when you've done, you take a trip and when it was a real good trip, that you got to know the people, you learn new things. Ideally, you had an experience that the average tourist or the average traveler doesn't have in that place. That's, to me, is real travel. Bogus travel, you go somewhere, you kind of wander around, maybe you have, brief conversations with people, you see a lot of things, but nothing really sticks. And nothing really, you leave it. I used to say there were two kinds of countries or places I'd visit. The places I'd come home, I'd write the story and not think about much again. And there were those places where I went there, I came home, I wrote about them, and they stayed with me. I just felt, and still do, very emotionally attached to those places.
So there's that wonderful quote from Henry Miller, which you're familiar with, which I love, about travel. He said, "One's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things," which I think is what Freya Stark is talking about, real travel.
Yeah.
Did your time in Poland and Europe more broadly, did it change? You were a young man then. Did it change your way of looking at the world, and has it stuck to this day?
I'm sure it did. I'd be a very different person if I hadn't had those experiences, hadn't done that. And I think even my reading changed the way I view things and see people.
So you come home after a few years, a couple of years in Warsaw, pivotal years, and you're returning to America in the 1980s. T.S. Eliot famously talks about at the end of all our exploring. Wait, I had to write it down. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Did you view America, Philadelphia, I think you were in at the time, New Jersey, any of this differently? Did you feel differently about America, not only differently about Poland when you got home?
Yeah, and as I think everybody who's been abroad has experienced, when you come back, things look differently. You see things differently. I have one vivid memory. I came home from Poland on a ocean liner, the
Right.
Stefan Batory, a Polish ship that sailed in those days between Gdynia and Montreal.
Is it still sailing? Because I want to take it.
No, it's long gone. But my parents drove up to pick me up in Montreal, and then we drove down back to New Jersey. And the thing I remember is listening to the radio, and it seemed like every advertisement had to do with money. There was ads for savings and sales and money. And 2 years in Poland, I had not heard anybody talk about money. Nobody had much, so it wasn't.
There wasn't much to talk about.
There wasn't much. It wasn't. People talked about books and movies and things like that. But this focus on money, and I realized, that's big here.
Yeah. I remember when I was living in India, I had a sort of equally transformative experience about a decade later in New Delhi, and coming back home and going to Whole Foods and being just overwhelmed by the abundance and the choice, which paralyzed me. I spent 45 minutes in the bread aisle and paralyzed with indecisiveness and left hungry.
That famous scene from Moscow on the Hudson when Robin Williams goes to buy coffee as a Russian immigrant.
Right.
Just all these brands of coffee. He has no idea what to choose.
Right. And I had that feeling when I came home, but then it like dissipates. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Like, then you get used to it. Oh yeah, there's 27 million types of bread. Okay. A couple more questions, then we're going to go to your questions. So you get two travel writers together, and invariably the topic comes up of, is travel writing dead? Travel writing people have been declaring it dead for as long as there have been travel writers. And
Like the novel.
But when I was reading about, particularly that you said at one point, we finally got a phone. And I'm thinking, they got a cell phone. No, not a cell phone, just a landline. There was no phone in your apartment in Warsaw. And, there was no texting, there was no email. You had a fully immersive experience in Warsaw. You were there, right? And you were nowhere else.
Right.
If young Tom Swick, 28, 29 years old, however old you were to go over to Warsaw now in 2023 and try to replicate that experience, could you do it? Would it be quite different?
No, not like that. No, the world's changed so much, and you just no. And I think that was an advantage, that I had that opportunity to just really be in the place. And I'd spent a year in France a few years before that, and I spent a year without talking to my parents. I mean, it just, the idea of making a transatlantic telephone call to say hello to my parents was just, it wasn't, it was unthinkable.
So some people would say, that's great. Now you can call and text your parents 10 times a day, which teenagers do apparently, when they go to Europe or go away to college. So what's the advantage of not talking to your parents for a year, assuming you had a good relationship with them?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Well, it wasn't just my parents. I mean, now you can call your parents, you could call your friends, and then you talk about things back home, and
it pulls you away.
There.
Pulls you away from the place. Speaking of places, for the last several decades now, actually, you have lived in what I think, at least climate-wise, is the polar opposite of Warsaw, and that is Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Yeah.
It is not gray.
It's not gray.
It is not gray.
No.
It is not cold. You say at one point, I am attracted to southern climates and northern mentalities. Definitely a southern climate there in Fort Lauderdale. Is there a northern mentality?
There is, actually, because of all the transplants and the snowbirds who come from New York and New Jersey and New England. So yeah, it turns out that it is maybe my ideal place. But I wrote that. I had that idea after living in Greece after I left Poland. And I found that I love the climate in Greece, except for the fact I was there in winter, but generally the sunshine. I mean, every day there was sun, and I love seeing the world illuminated by sun. But I like I got along better with the Poles. The Poles seem more, maybe because of the climate, and they were indoors more often, but they were readers, and they were interested in the life of the mind a little more than what I experienced. Though I should say in Greece, I was not in Athens. I was in a small city in the north, so it was a different. Well,
Greece does have a history of active minds.
It does.
Go back a while. Yeah. So finally, a little known, somewhat little known fact about you, because I follow you on various social medias that didn't exist back then. And all of a sudden I started noticing that these drawings are popping up, sort of like New Yorker cartoons. And I'm like, at first I thought, it's a true story, Tom is reposting a New Yorker cartoon or some cartoon. He's, people do that. And then I look at the little signature at the bottom, it's Thomas Swick, and these are your cartoons. Most writers can either write or artists can draw, but you can do both. And where did that come from?
I don't know. I'm left-handed, if that maybe explains anything. But I don't draw very well. That's the thing.
They're pretty funny, though. They're good.
That's the writer.
Okay.
That's the writer. But I just started doing them during the pandemic. Oh. Because people
But you did them before a little bit.
No. Well, just not on social media or anything.
Okay.
But the pandemic started, and people were posting photos of the sourdough bread they baked, or dance videos, and I can't do any of that stuff. But I just started doing some cartoons, and every Monday, every week, I just started posting one and I've been doing it since then.
That's
so
great.
And I enjoy it.
Are they Polish? They strike me as a little Polish, a little dark.
There's a fantastic Polish cartoonist, Mleczko. And he's still going, but he was very popular when I was there in the 80s. And if you want to experience Polish absurdity, look at some of Mleczko's cartoons. He is really wonderful.
Are some of them understandable without learning fluent Polish?
They're usually captions.
So we would have to learn Polish first. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to stick with yours, Tom. Just going to stick with yours. Thank you very much. And we are going to go to audience questions. And I promised Tom there would be at least one question. So
There will be at least 2.
All right, there we go.
And I would say, by the way, that if you want to see a gray city in this country, go to Chicago. All gray. Gray buildings, gray lake, gray sky. Anyway. Poland. I'm Jewish. And I think before World War II, Poland was like 30% Jewish. And that's where the Germans wanted to put the concentration camps. And there are hardly any Jews left. Although the things you're talking about, the sense of humor, that came with the immigrants, I think. Poland was always it was behind the Iron Curtain. I was born in the 40s. But it was always a place that we sort of had a sense of, and I was never quite sure what was real and what was storybook or what we were being told. Did you have any sense of the Jewish community that was there?
I write about that in one section of the 5th chapter. There was very little talk of Jews when I was there in the 80s. People were focused on solidarity. And, some of Solidarity's most brilliant strategists were Jewish.
I didn't know that.
Yes. Adam Michnik, Bronisław Geremek. And they, the thing is, Lawrence Wexler wrote for The New Yorker some wonderful articles about Poland at that time. And he made the observation that they were not Polish Jews, they were Jewish Poles. And Poles at that time were united. Solidarity was not just a free trade union that had become a political movement. It was also a societal ideal. And there was a real sense of solidarity in those years. And so that's what it was like then. And it was good to see. What's happened since, you'll find there's a real interest in Jewish culture among young Poles. There's a festival in Krakow every year that gets bigger every year of Jewish culture. There's now one in Warsaw because of the success of the one in Krakow. Krakow's old Jewish neighborhood is still intact, whereas the one in Warsaw was destroyed because of the ghetto uprising. But it's very heartening to see that these young Poles are trying to find out about this aspect of Polish life that's no longer there, but was once very vibrant. And
very old.
Yeah.
Centuries.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Next.
When I was a college student, I went on a vacation to Puerto Rico, and the people that I was with went to a casino one night, and I decided to do something a little different. There was a recital at a school where the students were playing the piano and their families were there, and I thought I'd go there and watch it and talk with some of the families, and I learned an awful lot about the local people and the culture. Is this something that you would consider to be like real travel?
Yes, I think that's one thing I always tell people: go where the locals go, and trying to get away from the tourists and have an experience that the locals have. Yeah.
When you mentioned that you worked at the Trenton Times, I happen to recall that one of the co-owners of this bookstore, Brad Graham, worked there perhaps around that time. So did your working careers overlap at all?
No, unfortunately, he had gone to the Post by the time I got to the Trenton Times, but I met him in Warsaw because when I was there, he was the Post's Warsaw correspondent.
Small world indeed.
Yeah.
Next. Thank you for your question.
Hi, I think Poland used to enjoy a reputation a little bit different from the one that the sort of life of the mind and the sort of indoor culture that you're talking about. It had a reputation for energy and almost for recklessness, the tradition of cavalry, a musical tradition you can hear in Chopin and the mazurkas, and you see these portraits of old Polish noblemen with rings in their ears and that kind of panache. Did that all go underground? Did you sense that when you were in Poland?
It's still that you find people, individual Poles who remind you of that. It's not widespread, but once in a while, you'll meet this very kind of eccentric, kind of just somebody who just stands out from the crowd. And I've always, when I do meet somebody like that, I'm always delighted because it reminds me of exactly what you're talking about. It's still there in some individuals, definitely. And during the communist era did not completely wipe that out. No. Thank you.
Next.
It's so interesting. Your book is like travel writing about not just a place, but a place during a certain time, like both with New Jersey and with Poland. And I wonder, like, are there places what's a place you regret most of not having captured, being able to visit as a travel writer during that specific time that now is gone? And are there places you fear like that are top of your list that you feel like, oh, I need to go there now, and this is the most interesting thing?
A place I regret not being able to, or not having gone to?
Yeah.
Oh, I would say Iran.
Oh, really?
I would love to go to Iran, and I just find something fascinating about Persian culture, and I just, that's really not possible right now. But
it's possible, but not advisable.
yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Well, the thing is this: we can't be, and this is my theory, we can't know every place and love every place any more than we can know every person and love every person. I think invariably we're drawn to certain places. For me, it was India. For you, it was Poland. Do you think, looking back at it now, there was chance involved, there was Hania and love involved, definitely. But is there something about your personality and Poland's national personality that were either complementary or enmeshed together?
I don't know. No, I don't think I'm. There are a lot of things about Polish culture that I don't necessarily relate to.
Mm-hmm.
I think sense of humor, I mentioned, that's one thing definitely where I feel I connect. But what happens, I think, when you fall in love with somebody from another country,
right?
Chances are, when you visit that country, you fall in love with the country as well, because that's the country, that's the culture that created the person you love. And I was fortunate not just to visit the country that created the person I love, but I was able to live there at a very momentous time in its history. So I really saw the people, I think, at their best. Hania has always said Poles are good in emergencies. And it was an emergency.
Yeah. They've had quite a few, actually.
They have.
Yeah.
They have practice at that.
Right.
Yeah. And so that, I think, explains my affection, my love for Poland. And again, the fact that it's an unsung place. It's a place that other people have overlooked, and I like to champion that kind of place.
So in a way, would it be fair to say that your love of Poland was an extension of your love for Hania?
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
That seems like a good place to end it. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Read the book. It's really, really good. Trust me. Thank you.